The phone shrieked, tearing through the oppressive silence of my dorm room. I knew that specific ringtone. It was the emergency tone, the one that always, without fail, meant one thing: Bella. My mother's voice was a frantic whirlwind of panic on the other end of the line. "Chloe, you have to come now. It's Bella's kidneys. The doctor said it's time." She was gasping for air between sobs, but the demand was brutally clear. "We need to get you tested. You're her only hope." I stared blankly at the textbook open on my desk, its pages a blur of highlighted formulas for the final exam that decided my entire scholarship, my one ticket out. "Mom, I have my physics final in the morning," I said, my own voice sounding distant and weak against her hurricane of emotion. "The exam is worth half my grade. I can leave the second I'm done, I swear." A cold silence met my plea. Then, a different voice cut in, one that always made the air grow heavy. It was my father, Mark, a man whose love was conditional on my complete and total obedience. "Your sister could die," he said, his voice dangerously low. "And you're worried about a stupid test?" The familiar sting of it, the casual dismissal of my entire life, was a fresh twist of an old knife. I tried to argue, to find some impossible middle ground where both my sister and my future could coexist, but he wasn't listening. "She doesn't have time for your excuses," he roared. Then I heard it over the phone, a sharp, violent crackle, followed by a sickening smash. He'd thrown something, not a plate. He'd thrown my old phone, the one I kept at the house, against the wall. It was a message delivered from 2 hours away, a reminder of his authority. This was not a discussion. It was a summons. My mother, Karen, a woman whose entire identity was built on the foundation of her daughter's tragedy, got back on the line. Her weapon of choice was never raw rage. It was the slow, suffocating poison of guilt. "Don't you love your sister?" She sobbed, her tears sounding practiced and devastatingly effective. "After everything we've done for you, this is how you repay us? If she dies, Chloe, it will be your fault." The line went dead, leaving those final words hanging in the air like a curse. I closed my eyes, the fight draining out of me completely. And the worst part? As I packed my bag, abandoning my own future once more, I wasn't even surprised. It was just the loudest echo of a story they had been screaming my whole life. To understand the drive to that clinic, you have to understand my sister. My twin sister, Bella, the beautiful, fragile, perpetually ill golden child. We were born minutes apart, but we might as well have been from different universes. From her first breath, Bella was defined by her ailments, her weaknesses. Her chronic kidney disease wasn't just a medical condition. It was her personality, her shield, and her crown. She was the sun around which our entire family revolved, and I was just a moon, tasked with reflecting her light and pulling the tides of her every need. Her pain was public, a grand performance for which everyone was expected to buy a ticket. My existence, on the other hand, was a quiet, thankless fact. This dynamic was never clearer than on our 16th birthday. I remember the weeks leading up to it, listening to my parents whisper about the perfect gift for Bella. She had been feeling down and decided that a purebred golden retriever puppy was the only cure for her emotional well-being. On the day of her party, it was never our party. They presented her with this yapping, ribbon-adorned creature. The cost was astronomical. Thousands of dollars I knew we didn't really have. I watched her parade the dog around the backyard, soaking up the adoration, the center of everyone's world. Later that evening, after the guests left, my mother handed me a small, plain envelope. Inside was a card. It read, "Happy birthday. Love, Mom and Dad." Tucked inside was a promise, a flimsy handwritten note saying that one day, when Bella was finally better and the medical bills weren't so high, they would make it all up to me. I stared at that cheap card and my internal ledger lit up. It wasn't just a puppy. It was the orthodontist appointments I was told were an unnecessary vanity, the school trips I wouldn't have enjoyed anyway, the threadbare laptop I had to use for my honors classes. All of it adding up to a debt they had no intention of ever repaying. That 2-hour drive to the clinic was different from all the others. Normally, these emergency summons would have my stomach in knots, my mind racing with a toxic cocktail of guilt, anger, and a desperate, pathetic hope that this time, this sacrifice, would finally be enough. But as the miles slipped by under my tires, I felt nothing. The emotional dam that had been cracking for years didn't just break, it evaporated. It was replaced by a strange, hollow calm, a quiet so profound it was almost unnerving. The frantic storm I had lived with my entire life had passed, and what was left was a still, cold clarity. It was in that stillness that the plan formed. It wasn't a scheme for revenge, or a plot to make them see my worth. It was much simpler than that. It was a resignation letter. I realized, with a certainty that felt like the only solid thing in my life, that I was done. I would no longer audition for the role of their daughter. I would no longer set myself on fire to keep them warm. I would walk into that clinic, I would let them take my blood, and I would fulfill my function as a biological spare part one last time. And then, no matter the outcome of the test, I would disappear from their lives forever. My mind, free from the usual emotional chaos, became a calculator. I started building the framework for my escape. I thought of the small stash of cash I had hidden away, earned from a part-time library job they didn't even know I had. Money I'd saved for a new laptop after they'd refused to replace my broken one. I thought of my scholarship, the one they saw as a triviality, and I started composing the email to my professor in my head, begging for a deferral on my exam due to a severe family emergency, the very things they had dismissed or taken from me. Those were now the tools I would use to build my new life. Each dollar saved was a brick in my wall. Each A+ grade was a step further away from them. When I walked into the clinic waiting room, the scene was exactly as I'd pictured it. There was Bella, looking pale and listless in a chair, the tragic princess in her sterile castle. Hovering over her were my parents, their faces a mask of angry relief the moment they saw me. My mother's eyes shot daggers, silently screaming, "You're late." My father just glared, his disappointment a heavy blanket in the room. I met their gazes, but I didn't flinch or apologize. I simply walked to the reception desk, took a clipboard, and sat down in the chair furthest from them. After a few minutes of their tense, whispered conversation, I looked up and said, "Let's get this over with." My lack of emotion, my calm refusal to play my part in their drama, seemed to unnerve them more than any argument ever had. I knew what they saw when they looked at me. They didn't see a daughter, a sister, or even a person. They saw a solution. I was a collection of compatible cells, a walking, talking blood bag with the right genetic markers. The great irony was that, for the first time in my life, I was agreeing with their assessment. Fine. I will be exactly what you think I am. I will be a biological resource. I will give you my blood, my tissue, my deoxyribonucleic acid, the very essence of me that you value so little and yet demand so completely. I was handing them the weapon they wanted, having no idea it was loaded and pointed right back at them. I let the nurse lead me into the testing room, a willing lamb to the slaughter. I thought I was giving them my blood. I had no idea I was about to give them the truth. We sat in a small, sterile consultation room that smelled faintly of bleach and anxiety. The minutes ticked by on a wall clock, each one a loud, deliberate click in the otherwise silent space. My father paced back and forth. My mother nervously fiddled with the strap on her purse, and Bella just sat there, looking fragile and expectant. They were already talking about the future, about Bella's recovery post-transplant, about how this time next year everything would finally be back to normal. They spoke as if my body was a signed and delivered contract, as if my consent was a mere formality they had already bypassed. I just sat there, a silent observer in my own life story, feeling the profound, peaceful emptiness of someone who had already left the building. The door finally opened, and a young, sharp-eyed nurse entered, followed by an older man with tired eyes and a white coat. Dr. Evans. The nurse was holding a tablet, and she didn't look at us. She looked at the doctor, her brow furrowed in a way that professionals try to hide when something is wrong. The doctor's forced smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Well, we have the initial results from the HLA typing," he began, his voice trying too hard to be cheerful. The nurse subtly angled the tablet toward him, pointing at a section of the screen. "Dr. Evans," she said, her voice low but clear, "can you look at this? There's a discrepancy." My father stopped his pacing instantly. "Discrepancy?" he snapped, his impatience flaring. "What does that mean? We don't have time for discrepancies. Is she a match for Bella or not? It's a simple yes or no question." His words hung in the air, clinical and demanding. He wasn't asking about his daughter. He was inquiring about a piece of medical equipment. The doctor cleared his throat, his gaze flicking uncomfortably between my parents, and then to me. He looked at the nurse, who looked back at him with wide, certain eyes. I saw her mouth a single, almost inaudible word as she pointed again at the screen. A word I felt more than heard. Mismatch. Dr. Evans took a deep breath, like a man about to deliver a verdict. He turned his full attention to my father, Mark. "Sir, the results are unusual," he started, choosing his words with surgical care. "According to this HLA typing, Chloe shares all the expected genetic markers with her mother." He paused, and in that pause, the world seemed to hold its breath. "However, she shares 0 common markers with you. It's a complete and total mismatch. The test shows a 100% exclusion." A thick, uncomprehending silence filled the room. My father just stared, a confused, almost comical frown on his face. "That's impossible," he finally stammered, shaking his head. "You must have mixed up the samples. They're twins. Run the test again." He looked at the doctor as if the man were an idiot, as if science itself were just a temporary inconvenience that could be corrected with enough forceful complaining. This was his world, a place where reality bent to his will. But the doctor didn't flinch. He shook his head gently, his expression now one of pity. "Sir, they are fraternal twins, not identical, which means they are genetically no different than any other siblings," he explained calmly, his voice stripping away my father's last shred of denial. "But even so, this isn't a simple difference. From a medical and biological standpoint, there is 0 possibility that you are Chloe's biological father." Every head in the room swiveled as one. Not towards me, not towards the doctor, but towards my mother. My mother, Karen, who had gone a ghostly, bone white. The blood had drained from her face, leaving behind a waxy, terrified mask. She stared at a spot on the floor, her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles were white. She didn't scream, she didn't cry, she didn't deny it. She just sat there drowning in a silence that was louder and more damning than any confession could ever be. And in that moment, my entire life snapped into focus. It was like a photograph developing in a dark room, the blurry shapes of my past suddenly becoming sharp, painful images. Every time I was told to be the strong one. Every time my achievements were hidden away so as not to upset Bella. Every time I was called cold or different, while Bella was showered with affection. It wasn't because I was the resilient twin and she was the fragile one. It was because I was the evidence of a secret. I was my mother's shame, her living, breathing betrayal. I wasn't the invisible daughter. I was the illegitimate one. And in the ringing silence of a truth that had finally been spoken, I didn't feel anger or victory. I just felt released. For the first time in my life, I was the one who got to walk away. Our parents were the architects of this whole universe. There was my mother, Karen, a woman who measured her own worth by the depth of her sacrifice for Bella. She wore her exhaustion like a badge of honor, her constant worry a testament to her profound love for her sickly child. Then there was my father, Mark, a man who saw Bella as a priceless, delicate vase that needed to be protected at all costs. In his eyes, I was not his other daughter. I was the sturdy, unfeeling shelf built to hold that vase up, to ensure it would never, ever fall. They were a perfect team, enabling Bella's dependency because it gave them purpose, and enforcing my independence because it made their lives easier. The breaking point should have come years earlier. In my junior year, I won the state-level science fair. The project I'd poured hundreds of hours into, a study on cellular regeneration, earned me the top prize, and more importantly, a $5,000 college grant. I remember sprinting home, the oversized check clutched in my hand, my heart pounding with a feeling I wasn't used to. Pride. I burst through the door and found my parents in the kitchen. I showed them the check, the joy bubbling out of me. My mother's face went pale. Her first words weren't congratulations, or "we're so proud." Her first words were a hissed whisper. "Shh, Chloe, put that away. Don't let Bella see it." I was stunned. "Why?" I asked. My father put his hand on my shoulder, his grip firm and silencing. "You know how sensitive she is," he said, his voice laced with disappointment, as if I were the one being cruel. "It will just upset her, thinking about all the things she can't do." I was instructed to hide my trophy in the back of my closet, behind old sweaters. The check was taken from me and deposited into the main family account, with the solemn promise that it would be kept safe for my education. Of course, within 2 months, that $5,000 was gone, absorbed by a new experimental treatment for Bella, a fancy new air filtration system for her room, a spa weekend for my mother to de-stress. When I quietly asked about it, I was told I was being selfish. The money had been used for the family, for Bella, and I was part of the family, wasn't I? That was their grand justification for everything, the false narrative they repeated until it became gospel. "We are a unit," my mother would say, usually after I was asked to give something up. "Chloe is strong, so she has to be the one to support Bella. Bella is sensitive, so she needs our support." My resilience wasn't a character trait they admired. It was a resource they could exploit. My ability to handle disappointment wasn't seen as maturity. It was treated as proof that I didn't have feelings to begin with. They had created a perfect, self-sustaining system where one daughter was all need and the other was all supply. Driving to that clinic, replaying a lifetime of being the spare part, a cold, hard certainty settled in my gut. They would never see me. They would bleed me dry for her and call it love. And I knew with absolute clarity that this had to be the last time. As the first raw, guttural sob tore from my mother's throat, and the man I had called my father for 18 years let out a roar of pure wounded betrayal, I stood up. The sound in that tiny room was deafening, a symphony of a collapsing world. Bella was crying now, a thin, confused wail, asking what was happening. But for the first time in my life, her tears had no power over me. They were just noise. I turned my back on the wreckage, on the screaming and the accusations that were just getting started. I walked past the stunned nurse who stood frozen in the doorway, and I didn't stop. Each step down the sterile hallway, away from the chaos, felt lighter than the last. I pushed open the clinic's heavy glass doors and stepped out into the afternoon sun, taking my first breath as a free woman. Later that week, my phone was a digital war zone. The screen was a relentless onslaught of notifications, a constant barrage from the life I had just abandoned. The messages from my mother, Karen, were a master class in manipulation. They swung wildly from pathetic, self-serving apologies about how she'd always loved me in her own way, to desperate pleas for me to come home and help her manage the situation. She wrote long, winding paragraphs about her own pain, her own fear, casting herself as the ultimate victim in a tragedy of her own making. There was no real remorse for the lifetime of lies, only terror at being left alone with the consequences. Then there were the texts from Mark. They were pure, uncut vitriol. He called me names I couldn't even repeat, blaming me as if I had somehow orchestrated this, as if my very existence was a malicious act of defiance against him. He accused me of being cold and unfeeling my whole life, and the irony was so thick I could have choked on it. He was a man drowning in pain, and he was throwing every ounce of his agony at me because I was the closest target. Reading his words, I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the cold, hard truth. He was a stranger, and his pain was not my burden to carry. Not anymore. Bella's messages were different. They were just lost, full of questions and confusion, asking why I had left, why I wasn't answering, why I wasn't there to fix things. She didn't seem to grasp the core of what had happened, only that her support system had vanished. She begged me to come home, promising that we could all talk it out and make things better, as if this were just another family squabble. It was then I realized that she had never seen me as a sister. Not really. She had seen me as a utility, a permanent fixture in her life designed for her comfort and support. Her messages weren't about losing me, they were about losing my function. I sat on the floor of my quiet dorm room, the room I had returned to after my escape. I looked at the endless scroll of their pain, their anger, and their need. I took a deep, steadying breath. Then, with a strange sense of ceremony, I opened my mother's contact. I looked at her name for a long moment, then I pressed the button. Block this caller. A small pop-up asked me to confirm. I did. Then I did the same for Mark. Block. Then for Bella. Block. With each tap of the screen, a cord was cut. It wasn't an act of anger or revenge. It was an act of profound and necessary peace. The screen went dark. The notifications stopped. And the silence that followed was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The next morning, I called my university. I explained that a severe, unforeseen family medical emergency had occurred, which was not a lie, and I was granted a deferral for my final exam. Then I took out the small bank book I kept hidden in my desk drawer. The money I had saved from my part-time library job, the money my parents told me was pointless, was now my liberation fund. I used it to put a deposit on a small studio apartment across town, a place that was mine and mine alone. I moved in with 2 suitcases and the science fair trophy I'd retrieved from the back of my closet. My new life was built on small, quiet moments of freedom. The simple joy of buying my own coffee and sitting in a cafe for hours to study, completely uninterrupted. The feeling of laughing with new friends from my physics class, people who knew me only as Chloe, the girl who was good at math, not as someone's spare part. I learned to sleep through the night without the fear of being woken up by a medical crisis. I learned that my strength wasn't a burden to be exploited. It was my own personal asset, to be used for my own future. Months later, a cousin I still spoke to occasionally gave me the update. Mark and Karen's divorce was finalized. He had moved out of state but had agreed, through lawyers, to set up a trust to cover all of Bella's legitimate medical expenses for the rest of her life. That was it. He wanted no contact, no visits, nothing. He had surgically removed them from his life. So my mother got what she had inadvertently created, a world that consisted only of her and her precious golden child. They were left alone together in that house, a fortress of their shared tragedy, with no one else to blame and no one else to use as a shield. I learned that the truth isn't always kind, but it is always freeing. They spent my whole life trying to make me a part of Bella's story, but it turns out I was never meant to be in it at all. If you've ever had to walk away to find yourself, share your story in the comments below. I see you.